Welcome to Photoshop. And so, a question that I get all the time is what do I need, or what type of computer do I need to run Photoshop? Now, a lot of this is going to be dependent on how much money you have to spend on purchasing a new computer. However, it does not matter if you get PC or Mac. Just so everybody knows, I've been using a Mac for 30 years. I got my first one in 1988. I've never used a PC and I probably will never use a PC. And it really has nothing more to do with that I'm familiar and comfortable with a Mac. So that's what I'll probably stick with. That being said, let's take a look at what's important or what you need in a computer to run Photoshop and what you don't need. The first thing we're going to take a look at is the processor. There are two main processor companies, Intel and AMD. You will not find AMD on a Mac. However, you will find AMD on PC. AMD does make good processors, but for sake of this video and keeping things simple, since Intel has a large majority of the market, we're just going to stick with Intel because most likely that's what you're going to end up buying. So Intel has a few basic models of processors: the i3, the i5, i7, and now the i9 processor. Processors come with cores or multiple cores. They can come with one core, two core, four cores, six cores, eight cores, 12 cores, and so on. The more cores that you have, faster the processor is going to be able to work. They also have threads, and some computers also allow what's called multi-threading. Now, what is a thread? A thread is software information that gets sent to a core to be processed. The more threads that you have, the more cores that you have, the faster a lot of times that your processor is actually going to be. This is important with Photoshop. Processors also have what's called a clock speed, how fast they run in hertz. A lot of times you'll see it's a 3.2 gigahertz computer, but can boost up to 5,000 gigahertz. What that means is if it's processing a lot of information for a second or two, it can run really fast, but then it has to slow back down to its normal speed. If it ran too long, basically the processor would heat up and that would cause some issues. Intel has more processors that we're going to see, but for the most part, what you're going to be seeing is Intel i3, the i5, the i7, and now the i9 processor. Something that should be noted: there are different versions of these processors, and I've put these in order. There's obviously ones before fifth generation, but you're not going to find those out there. When you're buying computers, a lot of times it might look like you're getting a good processor, like it might be an i7, but you're getting the Broadwell processor, which is like years old. And then you'll find another computer that has an i7 and maybe it has Coffee Lake and it's more expensive. Well, why is this computer more expensive? Well, because it's an eighth generation processor and it's going to be much, much, much faster than the fifth generation Broadwell. So when you're looking at a computer, you really need to look at whether it's an i3, an i5, an i7, and what generation of i3, i5, and i7 is it. The ninth generation has just come out. It is Ice Lake, and that has just been released by Intel. When you're purchasing a computer to run Photoshop, I would suggest that you go with a minimum of the i5 processor and get the latest version that you can, because this does make a big difference and it is going to be more efficient and run a lot faster. If you can afford the i7, that is going to be much better than the i5. And now on some of these new computers, you're starting to see the i9, which is really fast. But if you can stick with the i5 or the i7, you're going to be pretty much good to go for basic Photoshop use. The one thing I will say, if you're buying a PC, really pay attention to which processor you're getting in that computer. Mac's pretty good about putting the latest generations, but you'll see a lot of times on sites is Macs will be for sale and they'll be discounted. It's because they're trying to get rid of a seventh generation processor. Just because you see it on a PC doesn't mean that you'll see it on a Mac as well. So really make sure that you're paying attention as to what generation processor you are getting. The next thing that we're going to talk about here is RAM. RAM stands for Random Access Memory. You will usually see this installed and located on your computer as 4 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, and so on. This, what you see here, is a SODIMM. SODIMMs come in DDR3 and DDR4. Photoshop is a RAM pig. It says in the specifications that it only needs 4 gigabytes of RAM. I would highly disagree with that. I would say the minimum amount of RAM that you need to run Photoshop is 8 gigabytes. However, I would suggest that if you can afford it, that you can get 16 gigabytes and it's going to be much more efficient. One of the problems that you run into is when you're running a program, it needs to allocate a specific amount of RAM to each application. If you have a whole bunch of applications opened up at the same time, it all needs to use RAM that you have in your computer. If you only have 8 gigabytes, you're going to have a difficult time opening up a whole bunch of different applications because there's not enough RAM to kind of allocate each different application. The more RAM that you have, the faster your computer is going to run and the more applications that you're going to be able to open. So let's say you were using Lightroom, Photoshop, and Adobe Premiere. All those are going to need RAM to run. And if you have 3 programs that use a lot of RAM and you don't have enough, you're going to cause your computer to crash and lock up and have issues. One thing that you can do is if you don't have a lot of RAM, try to only open and use the applications that you want to use. So like if you're just using Photoshop, just open Photoshop and use that. That's going to let the computer allocate more RAM to your computer to run more efficiently. So the first type of drive, and this is the older type of drive that you have seen in computers for years and years. This is what's called a spindle drive. There's 2 different speeds. They usually spin at 5,400 RPM and 72. Now, most laptops are going to have 5,400 RPMs, and then most of your 3.5 or larger drives are going to spin at 72 RPM. Obviously, the higher the RPM, the faster the data rate exchange. So your read-write speeds are going to be quicker. To get a drive that holds 4 to 6 terabytes isn't going to cost you somewhere around $100 to $200. So they're very, very cheap for what you get. The problem is that inside a spindle drive, actually this disk is spinning and this little arm is reading the information, and these can fail and die. The second part of this is they're slow. Most drives are going to read between 100 and let's say 160 megabytes per second. Much slower than the second drive, which is going to be called the SSD. So the SSD, also known as a solid state drive, has no moving parts. Obviously, the benefits of a solid state drive is since there are no moving parts, you have a much less chance of anything breaking. However, one thing you should know is you can only kind of read write so many times to an SSD before it ends its life. You can't use them forever. As time goes down, they do slow down. Today, when you're buying a computer, you are much better to get an internal solid state drive to run your computer. I would actually say do not buy a computer with a spindle drive, only a solid state drive. Now, one of the issues with solid state drives, though they're really fast, you're going to see speeds from 400 megabytes per second and up. You will usually see the internal SSD start at around 256 gigabytes. Then you're going to go to 512, then to 1 terabyte and 2 terabytes. 2 terabytes can be really expensive, and sometimes even just the one is expensive as well. The good thing is to run your computer, you can do it with a 256 or a 512 SSD, and you're going to be fine. The problem is you're not going to be able to save your images or your info to your computer. So what most people are doing are putting a solid state drive into the computer and then saving their images externally, whether that's to another SSD or a spindle drive. So one thing that you can do is if you have an SSD in your computer, you can simply get a spindle drive as an external drive, and it's going to be really cheap for a whole lot of data. You can get a 4 terabyte for, just over $100. The next thing we're going to take a look at is a graphics card, or a GPU, which is a graphics processing unit. Now, a lot of cheaper computers are going to come with something called an integrated graphics GPU. And so you'll see these in Intel's a lot. So their processor, when you get the iCore, the i5 processor, is going to have an integrated GPU. And that's going to be actually perfectly fine for running Photoshop, because Photoshop doesn't use a lot of the GPU. It uses a lot of the processor and the RAM, but not a lot in the GPU. However, if you plan on playing video games or shooting video, you're definitely going to need a separate graphics processor. Almost all computers, you can get external graphics cards. Now, the external graphics cards actually are inside the computer, though they do make external ones that plug in, but most likely you're going to have it inside of your computer. Those two brands are called Nvidia and AMD. The last thing that we're going to take a look at is monitor resolution. So there are different monitor resolutions, and this is somewhere where I've seen over the years where PC models can really dumb down and give you something cheap. It looks like you get a really good computer that's really fast and has all this stuff, and it could be faster than a Mac, but then they give you this crappy, horrible monitor. When you're dealing with photos, what you see is going to be important. There's no sense in getting a high-end processor and graphics processor and then getting a cheap monitor. So the monitors come in 1080p, which is 1920 by 1080, known as full HD, which is most people's TV. The next version is 2K, which is 2048 by 1080. This is kind of a weird monitor resolution. I don't think a lot of people are getting this. The next one, which is 1440p, which you'll see kind of known as QHD, or kind of what Mac calls a Retina monitor, is 2560 by 1440. Now, this resolution monitor will give you the full sRG color space and about 75% of the Adobe color space. Now, I work in Adobe color space, and I'm only getting 75% of it. So 25% I'm not actually able to see on my monitor. The next step up from that would be a 4K monitor, which would give you a resolution of 3840 by 2160, and that is known as Ultra HD. And then you actually have 5K monitors and 8K monitors, but we're not going to get into those because I don't think the typical person that is going to be watching this video is going to put the money in to get a 4K monitor. Now that we've taken a look at what is in a computer, what's important, what do I need in an order of importance when buying a computer to run Photoshop? The first one is you're going to be your processor by far. So you want to get an i5 or higher multi-core processor. 4 would be good. More cores than that would be better. The second one is going to be RAM. You want at least 8 gigs of RAM, but I would say 16 is better. The next thing you're going to want, you want an internal SSD and an external spindle drive. The next thing you want is monitor resolution. I think HD, or that 1920 by 1080, is just too old of technology now. Basically, you're going to want 2K or higher. And in this case, I would say that 1440p is where you would want to start. This kind of 2K resolution is kind of a weird resolution. And the last thing is going to be your graphics card. You're going to be pretty much good to go with an internal graphics card unless you do plan to shoot video, and then you might want to take a look at some external graphics card. So hopefully this has been helpful. You learned a little bit about computers and what you need to run them. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.